So what we're going to take a look at in this lesson is just a very brief overview of what we get given when we created a web API project in .NET Core. Now we've got a bunch of files and folders in here, but the first thing I like to do is just get rid of these bin and object folders. Well, not get rid of them, so to speak, but hide them. Because these are created every time that we build or run our project, and we don't interact with them in any way during this course. So what we could do, if we go to Code and Preferences and Settings, and we search for Exclude, then what we could do is add, inside the files, we can add a pattern to exclude certain files or folders. Now, I've already got a bunch of things excluded in here. Yours may well be empty if you have just installed VS Code. But what I'm going to do is just add a pattern and just add a double asterisk for a wildcard, and then just specify obj, and then say OK, and we should see the obj disappear from our view. And I'm also going to add one for the bin folder, so ***/bin, and OK there, and that disappears from my view as well. Now the first thing we're going to do is just run our application and see what happens. So what I'm going to do is just open up my terminal window. And by the way, one of the great things about VS Code is we get an integrated terminal, and we've got shortcut keys on the background of VS Code to toggle this terminal window. And in my case, it's Control and apostrophe. So I'm just going to open up the terminal window. And what we're going to do is simply use one of the .NET CLI commands, and we're going to say .NET Run. And press return. This is just going to confirm that we've got a working project and it can run. So we've got a running project, but there's a couple of things I want to change, or one thing I want to change. At the moment, we're listening on both HTTPS and HTTP. We're going to keep things as simple as possible for as long as possible on this course, and that includes turning off HTTPS. We're not going to talk about security really on, and we're going to defer that till much later on. And we don't want to really be messing with self-signed certificates early on in the course. So we're going to turn this off. And the way that we turn that particular URL off, if we go into our properties folder inside our solution and click on the launch settings.json and just look for the dating app API section, and in here we have application URLs, and this tells our web server which URLs to listen on. Now we don't want to be listening on HTTPS 5001, so let's just turn that one off. And there's one more thing we'll change as well before we restart our application. Inside the startup.cs class, and we'll take a look at what this is in a minute, but if we scroll down in this file, then we've also got a method in here to use HTTPS redirection, and this is going to attempt to redirect any HTTP requests to HTTPS. Now, without worrying about what's going on in here at all, because we'll talk about this very shortly, we're just going to comment out this particular line. And the way that we add a comment to a line is just to use command and / in the case of a Mac, and I believe it's control and / in the case of Windows, but just comment out this line as well. And then what we'll do is we'll just stop our application by pressing Control and C, and then just restarting our application. And now what we can see is that we're just listening on localhost 5000. Now let's go and take a quick look at what this has given us inside our browser. And let's just browse to the address of our API server, which is localhost 5000, and press return, and oh no, nothing's happened. This localhost page can't be found. But let's go and take a quick look at why that is. Now, one of the things we get inside our web API project is a controllers folder. And these are our API controllers, and our API controllers contain endpoints, and these are the routes that our application is currently listening on. Now we're given a weather forecast controller as a freebie by default when we created our web API project, and if we go and take a brief look inside this file, then this tells us what routes are available to be listened on with our web API. Now each of these controllers, and we'll talk about these things in more detail, we've got a long way to go on this course, but each of these controllers contains a route, and this route contains controller in square brackets, and this controller in square brackets is really just a placeholder for the name of the class here, and controller is going to be substituted with weather forecast minus controller. So it's just going to take the first part of this name and use this as its root, which is going to take us into this particular controller. So in order to do anything and see our application working, and we won't worry about the details, but what this is going to do is just return a kind of weather forecast, just in plain text. Because it's an API, it's going to return the results in a JSON format. And let's go take a look at our browser and add the root onto our URL. So if I type in weather forecast, then what we see is a summary of whatever that controller is doing. We're not going to worry about the details, but this does confirm that our API is working and listening on localhost 5000 with the route that it knows about at this time. Now, I'm just going to very briefly run through what's contained in these files and folders so that we understand what caused our application to start up and how it knew to direct us to this particular controller. So first of all, every .NET Core application has a program.cs class, and this contains a single method. And when we started our application using .NET Run, it looks for the program class and it runs the main method inside this program class. It's looking for this main method. If this main method doesn't exist, we don't start our application. And this has got one job, and it's to call another method in here called the createHostBuilder. Now, this particular method, this is going to configure some defaults when we start up our application. And it's going to tell our application to use this thing called a Kestrel web server. That's the web server that's provided by .NET Core that's hosting our API. And it's going to configure some other defaults as well. And what this is going to do, it's going to configure logging. So when we do something inside our controller, we can see that things are being logged out into this console. And that's because logging has been configured inside this particular method. What it's also going to do is read from configuration files which contain our application settings. Now, we've got a couple of app settings files in our project at the moment, and these contain the configuration. And the only configuration we have at the moment is just logging information. And we've got logging that's going to be applied in production mode, and we've also got a development specific version of this where the logging settings are increased when we're running in development mode. And if we go back to the program.cs class, there's also something else in here where we can provide additional configuration for our application, and that's this startup class. Now, we're going to be coming back to this file time and time again, so I'm just going to very briefly run through what's inside here. First of all, we've got some configuration that's being injected into our startup class, and this allows us to access, if we want to, the settings that are inside our configuration I was just referring to then. And we can add, of course, additional configuration settings in there. Then we've got two methods inside here. We've got a configure services method and a configure method. Now, the configure services method, this is going to be our dependency injection container. Whenever we create something that we want to be consumed by another part of our application, then we're going to come in here and add it as a service, and then we'll be able to inject this service somewhere else in our application. We'll be doing lots of stuff inside here, so we'll come back to this again and again. At the moment, there's just a single service to add support for our controllers, or the single controller at the moment that we just looked at. And then we've got our configure method, and we use this method to configure the HTTP request pipeline. Now, as a request comes into our API, and we just made one when we went to our browser and called that weather forecast controller, then our request goes through a kind of pipeline, our HTTP request pipeline. And everything that we add in here is middleware. And middleware is software that we can use to interact with our request as it's going through its journey through the pipeline. So we've got a few things going on in here at the moment. First of all, we check to see if we're running in development mode. If we are, and we have an exception, then this is going to be caught by this particular method, and it's going to return a developer-friendly exception page. We'll talk a lot about exceptions throughout this course, so I won't go into detail here. And then we've got some other middleware. We're going to tell our application to use routing. We've already seen routing in action because our request was routed to that weather forecast controller. We've got another piece of middleware to use authorization, and this doesn't do anything at the moment because we haven't configured authorization. And then we've got a method to, or a piece of middleware to use our endpoints. And as our application starts up, it's going to map our controller endpoints into our application so that our application, our API, knows how to route the requests. And the only other file I want to mention at the moment is just the project file. When we created our project, we were given this CS_proj file. And there's not a huge amount that's going on in here at the moment. This just tells our application which framework it's targeting. Now, because we're using .NET Core 3.0, we're targeting the .NET Core App 3.0 framework. So that's all I want to mention at this moment in time about the project files. And what we'll take a look at next is our API controller in a little bit more detail.